He stood on the porch, holding the eviction notice. Silent, final, and impossible to ignore. This wasn't the first thing he had lost. Just the last thing still standing. Then a quiet boy stepped forward and handed him a drawing of a man, a dog, and a houseboat on still water. The boy whispered one sentence. "Don't let him lose his home again." He didn't believe in signs, but he kept the drawing anyway. So instead of stopping, the veteran Navy SEAL drove deeper into the forest until he found something broken that refused to sink. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. The morning light in northern Idaho had a way of pretending everything was still intact. It slid across the narrow wooden porch, catching on chipped paint and warped boards, warming surfaces that had long forgotten comfort. Pine trees stood tall beyond the dirt road, their shadows long and thin, swaying gently as if nothing in the world had changed. But Cade Mercer knew better. At 43, he stood still on that porch like a man who had already outlived something important. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that carried the quiet memory of weight long removed but never forgotten. His body still held the disciplined strength of a former Navy SEAL, lean and hardened, built not for show but for survival. His face was sharply cut, jaw defined, a shadow of untrimmed beard settling along his cheeks and chin. His skin was sun-weathered, lightly tanned, marked by years outdoors rather than comfort indoors. His eyes, blue-gray, did not rest on the world in front of him. They looked past it, like he was still scanning something no one else could see. The eviction notice in his hand trembled slightly, though not from weakness. It was folded once, twice, the edges already soft from being handled too long. 30 days. That was what it said. 30 days to leave the last place that had almost felt like a pause. Not home, not even close, but something quieter, something that didn't ask questions. Behind him, the door creaked softly as it shifted in the breeze. Cade didn't turn. He had already learned that looking back only made things harder to leave. The truth was simple. He hadn't lost the house today. He had been losing it for months. The job at the small lumber repair shop had gone first. Not because he couldn't do the work, he was faster, more precise than most, but because sometimes, without warning, he would freeze. A dropped wrench, a slammed door, a sudden voice behind him. For a second, or maybe longer, he wouldn't be there anymore. People noticed. They didn't say much. They never did. But fear didn't need words. And Cade had grown tired of pretending he didn't see it in their eyes. A soft sound broke through the quiet. Not loud, not urgent, just present. Flint. The German shepherd moved from the doorway and sat beside him without command. 6 years old, black and tan coat thick and clean despite the dust of the road. Flint carried himself with a balance of strength and restraint that only came from years of disciplined training. His muscles were tight but not tense, ready but controlled. His ears stood alert, catching everything, while his eyes, dark, focused, unsettlingly aware, locked onto Cade. Not the road, not the trees. Him. Flint didn't ask questions. He never had. But there was something in the way he watched Cade, steady, unwavering, that felt less like obedience and more like understanding. Cade exhaled slowly. "We're out of time," he muttered. Flint didn't move, didn't react, just stayed. A presence, a weight, a reason. Across the narrow yard, movement flickered behind a leaning wooden fence. A small figure stood half hidden in shadow. Noah Wren, 9 years old, thin in a way that spoke more of quiet isolation than hunger. His pale skin contrasted with the unruly strands of light brown hair falling unevenly across his forehead. His eyes, large, observant, too old for his age, studied the world without engaging with it. Noah rarely spoke. Most people had stopped expecting him to. But he watched, always watched. Especially Flint. Flint noticed him immediately. The dog stood, moving with calm purpose across the yard. Not fast, not cautious, certain. Noah didn't step back. Instead, he lifted his hand slightly, hesitant at first, then steadier. When Flint reached him, the boy placed his hand against the dog's neck, fingers pressing into the thick fur as if grounding himself to something real. Flint lowered his head just enough, matching him. Equal. Cade felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain. Not quite. Something older. Noah reached into the pocket of his oversized gray hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He hesitated, glanced at Cade, then stepped forward, each step deliberate, like he had practiced it in his head before doing it for real. Cade walked toward him slowly, boots pressing into dry dirt. Up close, Noah looked even smaller, but his eyes didn't drop. They held. The boy extended the paper with both hands. Cade took it, unfolded it. It was a drawing, rough lines, uneven color, done with worn crayons that had been pressed too hard in some places and too lightly in others. A man stood beside a large dog, both facing water. Behind them, something floating. A houseboat. The details weren't precise, but the feeling was. Stillness, balance, something waiting. Above them, drawn in simple strokes, was a symbol, a 4-pointed star. Cade frowned slightly. "You drew this?" he asked. Noah nodded once. "For me?" Another nod. Cade's fingers tightened slightly around the paper. He hadn't stood near open water in years, not since before everything had gone wrong. Then Noah spoke. His voice was soft, careful, like something unused. "Don't let him lose his home again." Cade blinked. The words landed heavier than they should have. "Who?" he asked quietly. Noah didn't answer. He just looked at Flint. Flint stepped back toward Cade, brushing lightly against his leg. And for a brief moment, everything went quiet. As Cade turned back toward the house, something strange happened. Flint stopped. Not hesitated. Stopped. His entire body went still, ears lifting sharply, gaze snapping toward the front door. Cade followed the look. The door, he was certain, had been slightly open. Now it was closed. Not gently, not from the wind. Closed. Flint took one slow step forward, then another. His posture changed. Lower, tighter. Not fear. Recognition. Cade felt it immediately. That shift. The one he had learned never to ignore. Something wasn't right. For a moment, the quiet morning fractured. The trees still swayed. The light still fell. But underneath it, something felt wrong. Cade reached for the handle, paused, then pushed the door open. Inside, everything was exactly as he had left it. The worn couch against the wall, the small table, the half-packed duffel bag, dust drifting through sunlight. No movement, no sound, nothing. Flint entered first, scanning the room with slow, methodical steps. His nose stayed low, tracing invisible lines across the floor, mapping the space in a way Cade never could. Seconds passed. Then Flint stopped, looked back, relaxed. No threat. Cade let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Yeah, he muttered. We're done here. But something lingered. Not danger, not exactly, just a feeling, like he had almost noticed something important and missed it. He packed quickly. There wasn't much, a few clothes, a jacket, tools, the drawing. He folded it carefully this time and slid it into the inside pocket of his field jacket. Flint lay near the door while he worked, watching every movement. Not restless, not anxious, just present. By noon, Cade stepped off the porch for the last time. He didn't look back. People who looked back got stuck. He had learned that the hard way. The old pickup truck started on the second try, the engine coughing before settling into a rough rhythm. Cade gripped the wheel, staring ahead. The road stretched out between the trees. Bright, open, empty. He didn't know where it led. Didn't need to. Leaving was enough. Flint jumped into the passenger seat, sitting upright, eyes forward. Every now and then, he glanced sideways at Cade, not checking, measuring, making sure he was still there. Cade pulled onto the road. The house disappeared behind him. Then the street. Then the town. For a while, neither of them moved. Didn't speak, didn't think. Just drove. Miles passed. The forest thickened. The air changed. Cooler, cleaner. Something loosened in Cade's chest. Not relief, not yet, but space. As the sun shifted overhead, Cade reached into his jacket and pulled out the drawing again. He looked at it longer this time. The man, the dog, the water, the houseboat, the star. His fingers brushed over the symbol. Something about it felt familiar. Not memory, not recognition, just unfinished. He glanced at Flint. You believe in stuff like this? He asked quietly. Flint didn't respond. Didn't need to. Cade let out a small breath, almost a laugh. Yeah, me neither. But he didn't put the drawing away. Not right away. The road curved ahead, disappearing deeper into the forest. And for the first time in a long time, Cade Mercer wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about where the road might take him, and whether, somewhere out there, something was already waiting. The road stretched forward like a quiet promise no one had signed. Tall pines lined both sides, their trunks rising straight and endless, bark dark against the pale light filtering through the canopy. The forest here didn't feel crowded. It felt deliberate. Every tree stood where it belonged. Every shadow fell with purpose, and the air carried a clean sharpness that settled deep in the lungs. Cade Mercer drove without music. The old pickup rattled gently over uneven gravel, its engine steady but worn, like something that had survived longer than it was meant to. His left hand rested loosely on the wheel, while the right hovered near the gear shift, fingers twitching slightly every time the road curved tighter than expected. He still scanned, always scanned, even here. Flint sat upright in the passenger seat, body still but alert. Sunlight caught along the ridge of his back, highlighting the contrast of black and tan fur. Each movement controlled, efficient. His ears flicked occasionally at distant sounds, branches shifting, birds scattering, the faint hum of something mechanical far off the road. But every few minutes, he looked at Cade. Not long. Just enough. Checking, measuring, making sure he hadn't slipped somewhere else again. Cade didn't acknowledge it, but he felt it. The drawing sat folded in his jacket pocket, heavier now than it had any right to be. He hadn't looked at it again since leaving town, but its presence lingered, like a question he hadn't decided whether to answer. The forest opened slightly as the road dipped into a clearing. That's where he saw the shop. It wasn't much. A low metal structure faded to a dull gray with a roof that had been patched more than once. A few rusted engines lay scattered outside, along with tools that had clearly seen decades of use. A wooden sign hung crookedly near the entrance, its paint worn down to almost nothing. But there was order, not chaos. Every piece of machinery was placed with intention, even in decay. Cade slowed the truck, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Flint leaned forward slightly, interested, not tense, just aware. Cade parked and stepped out. The air smelled like oil and metal, mixed with pine and dust. A strange combination, but not unpleasant. It reminded him of places where things were broken, but not abandoned. A man stood near a workbench just outside the shop. Elias Boone. He looked to be in his early 70s, tall but slightly bent at the shoulders, like gravity had been pulling harder on him for years. His frame was lean, built from a lifetime of physical labor rather than any kind of training. His hands were dark with grease, veins prominent beneath weathered skin, fingers rough and precise in the way of someone who knew machines better than people. His face carried deep lines, not just from age, but from something heavier. Loss. His hair was thin and gray, pulled back loosely, and his beard, short, uneven, was streaked with white. But it was his eyes that stood out. Sharp, clear, not judging, just seeing. Elias looked up as Cade approached. Didn't smile, didn't frown, just nodded once. "Truck's still running," he said, voice rough but steady. Cade glanced back briefly. "For now." Elias wiped his hands on a worn rag, stepping closer. His movements were slow, but not weak, controlled. "You passing through?" he said, not asking. Cade shrugged slightly. "Something like that." Elias studied him for a moment longer than most people would. Then his gaze shifted to Flint. The dog stood beside Cade, posture calm, but his eyes locked onto the older man with quiet intensity. Elias nodded again. "Good dog," he said. Flint's ears flicked once, approval noted. Cade didn't respond. Didn't need to. Silence settled between them. Not awkward, not forced. Just there. Elias leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. "You ever fix boats?" Cade shook his head. "Engines, vehicles, field repairs." Elias grunted softly. "Close enough." He looked out toward the tree line for a moment, like he was deciding something. Then he spoke again. "There's a place north of here, deep in the trees. Lake sits quiet most of the year. Not many people go out that way anymore." Cade waited. Elias continued. "Used to be a man out there. Gideon Hale. Lived on a houseboat." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Marine. Long time ago." Cade's jaw tightened just a fraction. Elias noticed, but didn't comment. "Boat's still there," he said. "Or what's left of it." Cade tilted his head slightly. "Why's no one taking it?" Elias let out a dry breath that might have been a laugh. "Because it's not worth taking." He pushed off the bench, stepping closer. Rotting wood, rusted hull, dock fees backed up for years, lands tied up in paperwork. Some investor wants to clear the whole place soon. Cade absorbed that. A dead end. That was what it sounded like. But something about the way Elias said it. Like he wasn't just describing a boat. "You telling me to go there?" Cade asked. Elias met his gaze directly. "I'm telling you," he said slowly, "that some things look finished when they're not." The words landed heavier than expected. Cade didn't respond immediately. Flint shifted slightly beside him, brushing lightly against his leg. A reminder. Still here, still moving. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it over. Directions, he said. Roads not marked. Easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Cade took it. Didn't unfold it right away. Why me? He asked quietly. Elias shrugged. Because you showed up. That was it. No explanation, no sympathy, just a fact. Cade left the shop not long after. The road narrowed as he followed the directions, trees closing in tighter, branches stretching overhead like ribs, forming a tunnel of light and shadow. The deeper he drove, the quieter it became. No distant traffic, no hum of civilization, just wind and wheels on dirt. Flint remained alert. But something about his posture had changed. Not guarded, not tense, focused, like he was tracking something. It happened fast. A sharp blast of a horn cut through the silence, loud, violent, too close. A logging truck tore past an intersecting dirt path Cade hadn't seen, its massive frame rattling the ground as it roared by. Cade's hands tightened on the wheel instantly. Too tight. His breath hitched, vision narrowing. The road disappeared. The trees blurred, the sound twisted into something else. Something older, buried, waiting. For a split second, he wasn't there. Flint moved before the truck was even gone. The dog pressed hard against Cade's arm, body angled just enough to anchor him without taking control. A low, steady vibration rolled from Flint's chest, not a growl, not a bark, something deeper, something grounding. Cade blinked once, twice. The road snapped back into place. His grip loosened slightly, air filled his lungs again. "I'm good," he muttered, voice tighter than he wanted. Flint didn't move away. Not yet. He stayed pressed against him for another second, then slowly returned to his seat. But his eyes remained on Cade, not trusting the moment to be over. And Cade knew that it wasn't the sound that had almost taken him. It was how close he had come to letting go. The rest of the drive passed in silence. But it was a different silence now, heavier, more aware. By the time the trees began to thin again, the sun had started its slow descent, turning the light softer, warmer. The road dipped, then opened. And there it was, the lake. It stretched wide and still, its surface reflecting the sky in long streaks of gold and pale blue. The surrounding forest leaned inward, as if protecting it from the rest of the world. A narrow wooden dock extended into the water, weathered and uneven, but still standing. And at the far edge, the houseboat. It leaned slightly to one side, its once white hull overtaken by rust and time. The wooden cabin above it was faded, paint peeling in strips, windows clouded with age. It looked like it had been sinking slowly for years, but had somehow refused to finish. Cade stepped out of the truck. The air felt different here. Quieter, not empty, just patient. Flint jumped down beside him, then paused. His ears lifted. His gaze fixed on the boat, not scanning, recognizing. Cade noticed immediately. "You see something?" he asked quietly. Flint didn't move, didn't bark, just stood there, watching. Cade followed his line of sight. The houseboat didn't look like much, not to anyone else. But standing there, with the lake stretching out behind it and the forest holding everything in place, it didn't feel abandoned. It felt unfinished. Cade took a slow step forward, then another. The dock creaked beneath his boots as he approached. The wood was old, but it held. Each step measured, deliberate. Flint moved beside him, close but not touching. As they reached the edge of the dock, Cade stopped. The boat was closer now. He could see the cracks in the wood, the rust eating through the metal, the way it dipped slightly into the water. He should have seen a problem. A burden. A mistake. Instead, he saw something else. Not what it was. What it had been. And what it might be again. The wind shifted slightly, rippling the surface of the lake. For a brief moment, the reflection broke, then settled again. Cade exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said under his breath. Flint stepped forward first, onto the narrow plank leading to the boat. He didn't hesitate, didn't test the wood, just moved, certain. Cade watched him for a second, then followed. And somewhere, deep beneath the sound of water and wind, something shifted. Not in the boat, not in the forest, in him. The dock did not welcome visitors so much as endure them. Its boards were silvered by weather, cracked in long pale veins, and the nails showed rust around their heads like dried blood. The lake beyond it remained still under the late afternoon light, bright enough to look innocent, but too quiet to feel empty. Pines ringed the water on all sides, dark and tall and patient, while thin birches caught the sun and flashed white between them like bone. Cade Mercer stood at the edge of the dock and looked at the houseboat without moving. Up close, it was worse. The hull had once been painted white, maybe even proud once, but years of neglect had dragged it into a mottled skin of rust, peeling paint, and dark water stains. The wooden cabin above it leaned slightly to the right, as if tired of holding itself together. Several window panes were fogged or cracked, and the narrow railing along the front deck sagged in one corner. It should have looked dead. Instead, it looked stubborn. Flint moved first. The German shepherd stepped onto the warped dock planks with controlled, silent certainty, black and tan coat catching the light in sharp, clean lines. He was 6 years old, mature enough to have lost the reckless energy of youth, but still powerful. Muscular shoulders, compact hips, and the disciplined stillness of a dog trained to observe before reacting. His ears remained forward, his eyes scanning the houseboat, not like a curious animal, but like a sentry recognizing a structure that had once mattered. Cade followed him slowly. At the far end of the dock, near a weathered post with an old rope coiled around it, a woman stood waiting. She looked as if she belonged to the place in the same way the dock did. Not polished, not temporary, but made durable by weather and repetition. Mara Bellamy was in her early 50s, average height, broad through the shoulders and hips, in the way of someone who worked with her hands and stayed on her feet all day. Her hair, brown threaded with silver, was tied back low at the nape of her neck, though the wind had already tugged several loose strands across her face. Her skin had been darkened by years outdoors, and her hazel eyes were sharp without being hard. She wore a faded cotton work shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, an old apron tied loosely at her waist, and rubber boots marked with dried mud. There was nothing theatrical about her. She had the face of a woman who had seen men arrive at the edge of themselves before, and had learned not to crowd them with kindness. "You're the one Elias sent," she said. It was not a question. Cade nodded once. "Guess so." Her gaze flicked over him, taking in the field jacket, the old military watch, the set of his shoulders, then moved to Flint. The dog stood beside Cade, still and alert, head slightly lowered, watching her hand rather than her face. Mara noticed that too. "Well," she said softly, "if the dog doesn't hate me, that saves us time." The corner of Cade's mouth almost moved. almost. Mara turned and gestured toward the boat. That's the one? Cade let out a slow breath through his nose. You weren't exaggerating. No, she said. I've found life easier without that habit. She stepped carefully onto the houseboat's short gangplank, which dipped beneath her weight but held. Cade followed, the wood groaning under his boots. Up close, the smell rose stronger. Wet timber, old metal, lake water, mildew, and something underneath it all that felt older than rot. Not foul, just sealed away. Mara rested one hand on the cabin frame as if touching an old gravestone. This belonged to Gideon Hale, she said. Marine. Came back from Vietnam with a body that still worked and a mind that didn't always listen to him. Bought this boat nearly 30 years ago, fixed it up piece by piece, lived out here most of the year. Cade looked at the warped roofline. And then? Mara's expression didn't change much, but something quieter passed through it. Then he got older, she said. And lonelier. Those are different things, though people like to pretend they're the same. Cade did not answer. Mara continued. He died 2 winters ago, heart, most likely. No family came. No one claimed the boat. Dock fees piled up. Paperwork got messy. The county doesn't care about sentiment, and the landowner cares even less. As if summoned by the word, another vehicle rolled up along the gravel road behind the dock. Cade turned. A dark SUV came to a stop near the tree line. A man stepped out with the efficient impatience of someone whose time had always belonged to money first. Victor Kane was tall, perhaps in his late 40s, lean without softness, dressed in a charcoal coat too refined for a place like this. His dark hair was neatly kept, touched with just enough gray at the temples to suggest control rather than age. He had a narrow, intelligent face, clean-shaven, with eyes that missed very little and warmed to almost nothing. He didn't stride toward them so much as cut through space. "Ms. Bellamy," he called. Then saw Cade and adjusted with the ease of someone who could make a greeting sound like a warning. "You must be the new complication." Mara's jaw tightened just enough for Cade to notice. Victor stepped onto the dock, carefully avoiding the worst boards. He looked at the boat, then at Cade, then at Flint, with a glance that hovered on the edge of distaste, but never quite committed. "The arrangement is simple," Victor said. "The structure is behind on fees, in poor condition, and technically still part of an unresolved holding dispute. If you want it, the transfer can be done informally for $10 and a signed assumption of responsibility." Cade stared at him. $10. Victor folded his hands behind his back. "The amount is symbolic. The liability is not." Mara crossed her arms. "You forgot the part where you were planning to drag it out and scrap it." Victor didn't look at her. "Because sentiment does not strengthen structural integrity." "No," Mara said, "just reveals who never had any." Victor's expression barely shifted, but Cade could tell the exchange wasn't new. The man turned back to Cade. "You can keep it, repair it, or sink with it. I don't particularly care which, but if that hull leaks oil, collapses the dock, or becomes a legal nuisance, I will remove it, along with anything inside." The words settled hard in the air. Not dramatic. Final. Cade looked again at the houseboat, at the rusted seams, the cracked windows, the way the deck boards rose and buckled where water had pushed up from below. $10 was not a bargain. It was a dare. Before Cade could answer, Flint stepped away from him. No command had been given. No noise had drawn him. The German shepherd moved to the cabin entrance with sudden, quiet purpose and stopped at the threshold. His body did not tense in warning. Instead, he lowered his head toward the wood beside the door and stood utterly still, not sniffing wildly, not pawing, listening. Cade felt the shift immediately. Mara noticed too. "What is it?" she murmured, though she asked the question to the dog, not the man. Flint lifted one paw but did not touch the wood. His eyes stayed fixed on a spot near the base of the frame. Cade stepped closer. There, beneath grime and weathering, cut shallowly into the old timber, was a symbol. A four-pointed star, simple, deliberate. The same shape Noah had drawn above the water on that folded piece of paper. Cade went still. For one brief second, the lake, the dock, Victor's polished shoes, Mara's silence, all of it seemed to pull back and leave only that mark in the wood. He had never seen it before. He was sure of that. And yet something deep in him recoiled, the way memory recoils when it almost recognizes itself. Flint finally looked up, not at the mark, at Cade, as if asking whether he understood. He didn't. But he couldn't walk away from it now. Victor broke the silence first. "Well?" Cade straightened. His hand went into the inside pocket of his jacket and found the last of his cash. The $10 bill was slightly bent, warm from being carried too long. He looked at it, then at Mara. "What happens if I take it?" Mara answered before Victor could. "You get the keys, the paperwork I've got, and whatever's left of Gideon's mess. You also get a place no one bothers unless they want something." Victor added, "And you accept full responsibility for the condition of the structure effective immediately." Cade let out a low breath. You really know how to sweeten a deal. For the first time, Mara gave him the faintest hint of a smile. "There he is," she said. Victor, unimpressed, produced a folder from under his arm. There were only a few papers inside. Temporary transfer acknowledgement, liability assumption, a note about overdue dock access charges, frozen pending occupancy. Nothing elegant, nothing sentimental, just enough bureaucracy to make abandonment official in reverse. Cade read every line. Victor watched with the tight patience of a man accustomed to others signing first and understanding later. When Cade finished, he signed. Then he handed over the $10 bill. Victor took it between two fingers, as though symbolic money still deserved symbolic distance. "Congratulations," he said. "It's now your problem." He turned and walked back toward the dock without waiting for a reply. Mara watched him go, then shook her head slightly. That man was probably born wearing polished shoes. Cade folded the copy of the papers and tucked them into his jacket. "Seems uncomfortable." "It is," Mara said. "Mostly for everyone else." The line earned a short sound from Cade. Not quite a laugh, but close enough to prove he still remembered how. Mara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a ring with 2 old brass keys attached. One looked like it belonged to the cabin door. The other was smaller, worn smooth with age. "He kept both on him for years," she said. "One for the cabin, one for a padlock that isn't there anymore. Never figured out why he still carried it." She held the ring out. Cade hesitated before taking it. The metal was warm from her hand. For reasons he could not explain, that bothered him more than if it had been cold. Flint stepped onto the front deck of the houseboat. The boards dipped beneath his weight, but did not fail. He moved carefully, shoulders rolling, nose working the air in slow passes. Then he stopped near the cabin doorway again and waited. Not impatiently, expectantly. Mara looked at the dog, then at Cade. "He acts like he's been here before." Cade slid the keys into his palm and glanced once more at the carved star. "Yeah," he said quietly. That makes two of us." He did not mean it literally. At least he told himself he didn't. The light had turned warmer now, laying gold across the lake and catching in the cracked windows. The houseboat still looked half-ruined, still leaned, still smelled like damp neglect and forgotten years. But it was his now. Not because he had won anything, because he had chosen to carry the weight. Cade stepped toward the cabin. The old key scraped at first, then turned with effort. The door opened inward with a dry wooden groan. He stopped at the threshold, Flint beside him, Mara behind on the dock, the lake breathing softly against the hull. For one suspended moment, Cade did not feel like a man buying a wreck. He felt like someone standing outside a question he had already answered with his hands before his mind had caught up. Then he crossed into the fading light of the cabin, and the chapter of his life that had only known how to leave finally met something that might ask him to stay. The first nights on the houseboat were not quiet. They should have been. The lake barely moved after sunset, the wind slipping gently through the trees, the dock settling into long, tired creaks that came and went like breathing. It was the kind of place people imagined when they spoke about peace. But peace, Cade Mercer had learned, was not something a place could give you. It was something your mind had to allow. And his didn't. He slept in fragments. 30 minutes, maybe an hour at most. Each time he drifted too far, something pulled him back. Sometimes it was a sound. Sometimes it wasn't anything at all. Just the feeling that he had forgotten something important. Something he couldn't afford to forget. Flint never slept fully either. The German shepherd lay near the door most nights, body relaxed, but never slack, ears shifting at the smallest change in sound. Every time Cade woke, Flint's head lifted slightly, not startled, not alarmed, just confirming, still here, still breathing. By the third morning, Cade stopped trying to rest. He worked instead. The houseboat needed everything. He started with the obvious, clearing debris, checking the structure, pulling up loose boards that threatened to give way under weight. The tools he had brought were limited, but his hands remembered what to do, even when his mind didn't. Measure, test, reinforce, move on. It was familiar. That helped. But Flint didn't follow the same rhythm. While Cade moved from one section to another, the dog kept returning to the same spot inside the cabin, near the built-in bench along the wall. Not urgently, not aggressively, just returning. The first time Cade ignored it. The second time he noticed. By the third, he stopped working. Flint stood over the warped section of floor, head lowered, ears forward. He didn't scratch, didn't bark, just stood there as if waiting for something to reveal itself. Cade walked over slowly, boots pressing into the uneven wood. "You got something?" he asked quietly. Flint didn't look at him, didn't move. Cade crouched down, running his fingers along the boards. The wood felt softer here, slightly raised at the seams, as if it had been disturbed and then forced back into place. Not natural, not damage, intentional. He pressed down harder. The board shifted, just slightly. That was enough. Cade stood and grabbed a pry bar from the small pile of tools he had laid out near the door. The metal scraped as he wedged it into the seam. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sharp crack. The first board lifted. Flint stepped back immediately, giving space but not leaving. His eyes tracked every movement, muscles coiled but controlled. Cade worked slowly after that. No rushing, no guessing. Each board came up with resistance. Nails rusted deep into place, wood swollen from years of moisture. It took time, and more than once he had to stop, adjust his angle, rethink his approach. That was the difference between fixing something and breaking it further. Patience. Eventually, the opening revealed itself. A narrow cavity beneath the floor. Dark, still. Cade leaned closer, squinting into the shadows. He grabbed a flashlight from his bag and angled the beam downward. The light cut through the darkness and found it. A chest. Not large but solid. Old wood reinforced with metal edges, worn but intact. Leather straps wrapped around it, cracked with age but still holding. A rusted padlock hung at the front, its surface eaten by time but not yet broken. Flint made a low sound in his throat. Not warning, not fear. Recognition. Cade's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he muttered. "I see it." Getting it out was harder than finding it. The space was tight, forcing Cade to lower himself awkwardly into the opening. Boots braced against the edges, one arm reaching down while the other kept his balance. The air inside was colder, damp against his skin. His fingers closed around the edge of the chest. He pulled. It didn't move. "Of course," he muttered. He shifted his grip, braced harder, and pulled again. This time, it gave. Slowly, reluctantly. He dragged it upward inch by inch until Flint stepped closer, positioning himself near the edge as if ready to steady anything that might slip. Finally, Cade hauled the chest onto the cabin floor. He sat back for a moment, breathing heavier now, sweat mixing with dust along his arms. The chest sat between them, silent, heavy, not just in weight, in meaning. Cade ran his fingers over the lock. It didn't budge, seized completely. He stood stepping outside to grab a rusted hacksaw from the truck. When he returned, the cabin felt different. Not dangerous, not threatening, just occupied. Like something that had been waiting no longer needed to wait. As Cade set the blade against the lock and began to saw, Flint suddenly stiffened. The dog's head snapped up, ears rising sharply. But he didn't look toward the door. He looked past Cade, through him, toward the far wall. Cade froze. The sound of metal grinding against metal stopped abruptly. "What is it?" he asked, voice low. Flint took one slow step backward, then another. His body lowered, not into attack, not into retreat, but into something between. A memory. Cade turned slightly, following the line of the dog's gaze. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement. Not clearly, not enough to name, just a shift in the light along the wall where the sun filtered through the cracked window. Then it was gone. Nothing there. Just wood. Dust. Silence. Flint didn't relax immediately. He kept watching that spot for several long seconds before finally exhaling and easing back into a neutral stance. Cade swallowed. Hard. He had seen things before that weren't there. He knew that. But Flint didn't. And Flint had seen something, or thought he had. That was worse. Cade looked back at the chest. The lock. The moment passed. But not completely. Not really. He finished cutting through the metal. It took longer than it should have. The blade slipped once, twice, before biting through fully. With a dull snap, the lock gave way. Cade didn't open it immediately. He sat there, staring at the lid. Flint moved closer, sitting beside him now, not touching, but close enough to feel. Cade exhaled slowly, then lifted the lid. Inside, order. That was the first thing he noticed. Everything had been placed deliberately. Rows of small canvas bags, each tied with thin cord. Some were worn thin, others better preserved. A few paper envelopes rested along one side, edges brittle with age. Cade picked up one of the bags. He untied it. Coins spilled into his palm. Silver, old, not worthless, but not life-changing either. He opened another. More coins, a third, folded bills, aged but intact. He nodded once. Not a fortune, he said under his breath. But enough to matter, enough to mean something. He reached deeper into the chest. That's when he found it. A notebook. Small, leather-bound. The cover cracked, edges softened by years of handling. He lifted it carefully, almost instinctively treating it with more caution than the money. Flint leaned in slightly, sniffing once before pulling back. Cade opened it. The pages were filled with writing. Not neat, not consistent. Some lines were steady and clear, others jagged, uneven, as if written with a shaking hand or a distracted mind. Dates marked the edges, days, months, years. Some entries were long, others only a sentence or a single line. Still here. Cade flipped through slowly. Each page felt less like a story and more like a record. Proof, not of events, of existence. Gideon Hale had not written to be read. He had written so he wouldn't disappear inside his own head. Cade understood that immediately, more than he wanted to. He turned to the final pages. The writing there was steadier, intentional, like the man had forced himself to be clear. At the very end, one entry stood alone. No date, no explanation, just words. If you found this, then you're still standing where I once stood. Cade's hand tightened slightly on the page. He read the next line more slowly. If you've got a dog beside you, then you haven't lost everything yet. Flint shifted closer. Not touching, but there, always there. Cade swallowed, harder this time. The last line was simple. Don't leave this place the way I almost did. Don't leave yourself. The cabin fell quiet again. Cade closed the notebook halfway, then stopped. His fingers rested on the worn leather cover. He didn't feel relief, didn't feel hope. Not yet. But something had changed. Just slightly. Like a weight had shifted position inside his chest. Not gone, but no longer pressing in the same way. Flint lowered himself onto the floor beside him, resting his head on his paws, eyes still on Cade. Watching. Waiting. Cade looked at the chest. The coins. The notebook. The space beneath the floor where it had been hidden all these years. This wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't even a second chance. It was something else. Something quieter. Something that didn't demand belief. Just attention. Cade leaned back against the cabin wall, staring at the open chest, for the first time since he had arrived. He didn't feel like he needed to leave. And that scared him more than anything else. The air changed before the sky did. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the way the wind moved across the lake. No longer gliding, but pressing. The surface of the water tightened, losing its glass-like stillness, small ripples forming where none had been. An hour before. Cade Mercer noticed it without looking up. He was crouched near the edge of the dock, sleeves rolled past his elbows, hands steady as he worked a temporary seal along one of the outer seams of the hull. The metal was colder than it should have been, even under the afternoon light. He paused, listened. The forest had gone quieter, not silent, but restrained. That was never a good sign. Flint noticed it before Cade did. The German shepherd had been pacing in short, controlled arcs along the dock, never straying far, his movements precise and measured. But now he stopped entirely. Head up, ears forward, body still. watching the tree line. Cade followed his gaze. The sky beyond the pines had darkened, not gradually, but like a curtain being drawn too fast. Clouds gathered in thick, low layers, swallowing the blue. "Yeah," Cade muttered under his breath. "That tracks." He stood slowly, scanning the dock. There were weak points. He had already marked them mentally. Sections where the wood dipped too much under weight, where nails had loosened, where the grain had split from years of moisture and neglect. He had planned to fix them. Later. There was always a later. Flint moved toward him, brushing lightly against his leg. Not urgent, but insistent. Cade glanced down at the dog. "I see it," he said quietly. But he hadn't moved yet. That was the problem. The first gust of wind hit harder than expected. Not violent, but enough to shift balance, to make the dock creak in protest. The second came with sound, a low roll of thunder, distant but heavy. Cade exhaled sharply. "All right," he said. "We're done for today." He stepped toward the boat, intending to secure what he could before the weather worsened. Flint didn't follow immediately. He turned once, looking back toward the far end of the dock. Then he moved. Fast. The storm didn't arrive. It fell. Rain came in sudden sheets, thick and heavy, cutting through the air in angled lines. Within seconds, the dock darkened. The wood slick beneath Cade's boots. The lake shifted from quiet reflection to restless motion, small waves slapping against the hull with increasing force. Cade stepped onto the boat, moving quickly now, grabbing tools, securing loose boards, pulling a tarp over exposed sections of the cabin roof. Flint jumped up beside him, staying close but not in the way, his movements tight and efficient. Then, it happened. A sound. Not thunder, not wind. A crack, sharp, wet, wood failing under pressure. Cade's head snapped toward the source. The far section of the dock, one of the weak points he had noticed but left untouched, gave way. A support beam, rotted through at the base, shifted under the stress of wind and rain. It twisted, splintered, and collapsed inward. A long, jagged section of wood broke free and swung, straight toward the side of the boat, toward him. Cade reacted, but not fast enough. The beam dropped with brutal force, and Flint moved. The dog didn't hesitate, didn't calculate, didn't wait. Flint lunged forward, body colliding into Cade's side, pushing him just enough off balance that the beam missed its full impact. The wood slammed into the edge of the hull instead, scraping violently before crashing into the water below. But not before catching Flint along the shoulder. A sharp, short yelp cut through the storm. Cade dropped instantly. "Flint!" The German shepherd stumbled back, weight shifting unevenly onto his front leg. A thin line of blood ran through the soaked fur along his shoulder, the rain diluting it into streaks that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. But Flint didn't collapse. He stood, breathing steady, eyes locked on Cade, like the pain didn't matter, like it never had. Cade's jaw clenched. "You're okay," he said, though the words came out tighter than he intended. He crouched beside the dog, hands moving with practiced efficiency. The cut wasn't deep, but it wasn't nothing either. It would need cleaning, wrapping. Later. A new sound cut through everything. Water. Inside the boat. Cade turned sharply. The hull, one of the lower seams he hadn't reinforced yet, had split under pressure. Not wide, but enough. Water was seeping in, fast. Within seconds, the seep turned into a steady flow. Damn it! Cade stood, moving immediately. The floor panel he had removed earlier gave him access. He pulled it up again, revealing the bilge below. Water was already collecting, rising. Not quickly enough to sink them immediately, but fast enough to matter. He grabbed the manual pump, old and stiff, forcing it into position. Push, pull, push, pull. The motion came back instantly. Muscle memory, no hesitation. Flint stayed near the edge of the cabin, watching him, body angled slightly to protect his injured side. Rain hammered against the roof, against the deck, against everything. The world narrowed. Just the pump, just the water, just the rhythm. For a brief second, Cade stopped. Not because he wanted to, because something inside him did. The thought came fast, clean, too familiar. Leave it. It would be easy. Take the money, take the dog, walk away. He had done it before, more than once. Walk away before things got worse, before they broke completely, before he had to feel the failure all the way through. His hands loosened slightly on the pump handle. Just for a second. That was all it took. Flint moved. Not toward the water, not toward the damage, toward him. The dog pressed his body firmly against Cade's leg, ignoring the injury, forcing contact. Grounding, present, unavoidable. Cade looked down. Flint's eyes met his. Not questioning, not pleading, certain, as if the decision had already been made. Cade exhaled sharply through his nose. No, he muttered. Not to the storm, not to the boat, to himself. His grip tightened again. Push, pull, push, pull. The rhythm returned, stronger this time, not mechanical, intentional. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time blurred under the weight of repetition. Slowly, the water level stopped rising. Then, inch by inch, it began to fall. Cade didn't stop immediately. He kept pumping, forcing his arms to continue even as they burned, even as fatigue crept into every movement. Only when the bilge dropped to a manageable level did he finally pause. He sat back against the cabin wall, chest rising and falling heavily, rain still pounding against the roof. The boat wasn't safe. Not yet. But it was still floating. That was enough. For now. Flint lowered himself carefully onto the floor beside him, favoring his injured side but not showing it beyond the shift in weight. Cade reached over, resting his hand against the dog's neck. The fur was damp, warm, alive. You could have stayed back, Cade said quietly. Flint didn't respond. Didn't need to. Cade let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Yeah, he said. I know. Outside, the storm began to ease. Not ending, just passing like it always did. Cade leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closing for just a moment. The thought came again. Clearer this time. Not leave it. Something else. Stay. It didn't feel like a command or a plan. Just a possibility. One he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a long time. The rain softened. The lake settled. The boat creaked beneath him, wounded but intact. Cade opened his eyes, looked around the cabin, at the damage, at the tools, at the floor, at Flint. And for the first time since he had arrived, he didn't see a problem. He saw something worth fixing. Change did not arrive with noise. It did not come in the shape of a single moment or a sudden decision. It did not knock on the door of the houseboat or ask Cade Mercer if he was ready. It simply stayed. Quietly. Day after day. The lake returned to its calmer rhythms after the storm. But it was never quite the same. Neither was the dock, patched now in places where wood had splintered and failed. The repairs Cade made were not pretty, but they held. That mattered more. The houseboat followed the same path. It was still weathered, still scarred, but it no longer felt like it was waiting to collapse. The hull had been sealed in sections, reinforced where the metal had thinned. The boards inside had been replaced piece by piece, each one measured, cut, and fitted with careful hands. It wasn't perfect, but it stood. That was enough. Cade worked every morning, not because he had to, because it gave him somewhere to put the hours that used to slip away from him. His movements were quieter now, still efficient, still controlled, but less rigid. There were moments when he paused without immediately scanning for exits, moments when he simply looked out at the water without calculating angles or distances, not many. But they existed. Flint healed slower than the boat. The wound along his shoulder had closed, but the fur had not grown back evenly yet, leaving a faint, irregular patch where the injury had been. He favored the leg slightly when moving too quickly, though he never slowed enough for it to be obvious unless someone knew what to look for. Cade noticed. He always noticed. The dog had taken to resting near the edge of the deck during the afternoons, watching the lake with that same steady focus he had always carried. But there was something else now, a subtle shift in his posture. Not just awareness, ownership, as if the space no longer belonged to the past, as if it belonged to them. Cade didn't think about that directly. He just kept working. People came and went at the dock, not many, but enough. Fishermen with small boats, older locals who had lived near the forest long enough to forget how cities worked, a few quiet families who came out on weekends and left before dark. Cade saw them, but he didn't engage. At least, not at first. He kept to himself, answering only when spoken to, offering short responses that closed conversations before they had a chance to grow. It wasn't hostility. It was distance. Something learned, something practiced, and something he wasn't ready to give up. Mara Bellamy didn't push him. She would stop by occasionally, bringing small things, a container of food wrapped in cloth, a spare tool she thought he might need, once even a coil of rope she had repaired herself. She never stayed long, never asked questions he didn't answer. "Boat's holding better," she said one morning, standing at the edge of the dock with her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn jacket. Cade nodded. For now. Mara tilted her head slightly. "That's all anything ever does?" She left after that. No lecture, no encouragement, just truth. It happened on a late afternoon when the light had turned soft and the lake was beginning to settle into evening. Cade was working on the small outboard motor he had salvaged from a storage compartment, cleaning rust from its housing, when he heard it. A voice, distant, carried over water. "Hey!" He looked up. A small fishing boat drifted farther out on the lake, not moving with intention, just carried. A man stood at the back, waving one arm. "Engine's dead," he called. Cade didn't move immediately. He watched, assessed. Distance, wind, current. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it could be. The man in the boat was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. Even from that distance, Cade could see the stoop in his posture, the way his shoulders curved forward as if pulled down by years rather than weight. His hair was white, thick but unkempt, and his beard, longer than most, moved slightly with the breeze. He wore a faded green jacket and old work pants, both worn but clean. There was no panic in him, just frustration and patience. Flint stood before Cade did. The dog moved to the edge of the dock, ears forward, eyes fixed on the drifting boat. Then he turned, looked at Cade, not waiting, expecting. Cade exhaled, slow, measured. "No," he muttered quietly. "Not yet. Not ready." The word hung there for a second. Then Flint stepped forward. One step, then another, stopping just short of the water's edge. He didn't bark, didn't pace. He simply stood there, waiting. Cade felt it then. Not pressure, not obligation. Something else. The same quiet pull he had felt when he first saw the houseboat. Not loud, not forceful, but steady. He looked at Flint again. The dog's gaze didn't shift, didn't soften. It wasn't a request. It was certainty. As if in Flint's world, the decision had already been made, and Cade was simply catching up to it. For a brief second, Cade saw it clearly. Two paths. One where he stayed where he was, untouched, uninvolved, unchanged, and one where he stepped forward, risked something, not big, not life-threatening, but real. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "All right," he said quietly. Not to the man on the boat, to himself. Cade moved quickly after that. The small skiff tied loosely to the dock wasn't much, but it was enough. He untied it, checked the fuel line, and pushed off with practiced ease. Flint jumped in beside him, careful with his footing, settling near the front. The engine sputtered once before catching. They moved. The water resisted slightly, but not enough to matter. Within minutes, Cade pulled alongside the drifting boat. Up close, the man looked older than he had from a distance. His face was deeply lined, skin weathered by sun and wind. But his eyes, pale blue, were sharp. Tired, but not weak. "Appreciate it," the man said simply. Cade nodded. "Fuel line?" "Clogged, I think." Cade leaned over, inspecting quickly. The diagnosis came easy. The fix would take longer. "Gonna need a tow," he said. The man nodded once. "Figured." No complaint. No argument. That mattered. They secured the line and headed back toward the dock in silence. When they arrived, the man stepped out carefully, steady despite his age. "Name's Earl Whitaker," he said, offering a hand. Cade hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took it. "Cade." Earl glanced at Flint. "Dog's got sense." Cade gave a short nod. "Better than mine most days." Earl's mouth twitched slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. It didn't change everything. Not immediately. Cade didn't suddenly become part of the dock. He didn't start conversations or seek out work. But something shifted. People noticed. They always did. A day later, someone else stopped by. Then another. Small things, a question about an engine, a request for a tool. Nothing that demanded more than Cade was willing to give. But enough that he stopped saying no every time. That was the difference. Not that he became someone else, that he stopped refusing to be anyone at all. The package arrived a week later. No warning, no explanation. Just a delivery truck pulling up near the road, a young driver stepping out with a box in his hands. The driver looked barely 20, tall but awkward, shoulders not yet settled into their frame. His sandy blonde hair fell unevenly across his forehead, and his expression carried that quiet uncertainty of someone who hadn't quite figured out where they belonged yet. "Cade Mercer?" he asked. Cade nodded. "Got something for you, from Idaho." The words landed heavier than expected. Cade took the box. "Thanks." The driver gave a quick nod and left without lingering. Cade stood there for a moment, the weight of the package resting in his hands. Flint moved closer, watching, waiting. Cade carried the box inside the cabin, set it on the table, opened it carefully. Inside, paper, folded, familiar. He didn't need to read the name to know who it was from. He unfolded it slowly. The drawing had changed. The lines were stronger now, more deliberate. The man, the dog, still there. But behind them, the houseboat. Not broken, not sinking, standing. And above it, the star. Clear, centered, unmistakable. Cade sat down slowly, the paper resting in his hands. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't think, didn't question. Flint lay down beside him, resting his head against the floor. Present, as always. Cade looked at the drawing, then out at the lake through the cabin window. The light was different now. Not brighter, just clearer. For the first time since he had received that first drawing, he didn't feel the need to doubt it. He didn't need to understand it either. That was new. He stood, walked to the wall beside the window, and pinned the drawing where the light could reach it. Then he stepped back, looked at it, looked at the lake, and felt something settle. Not peace, not yet, but something close enough to recognize when it came. The seasons did not change all at once. They unfolded slowly, like a decision that took time to admit itself. Summer faded in layers. The bright green of the trees softened into deeper tones, shadows stretching longer across the lake each afternoon. The air cooled in ways that didn't demand attention at first, just enough to make breath visible in the early mornings, if you looked for it. The houseboat remained. That was the first truth Cade Mercer noticed. Not perfect, not restored to what it had once been, but standing. The hull held steady now, reinforced along the seams that had once threatened to split. The deck no longer dipped under his weight in uncertain ways. The cabin, once heavy with damp air and decay, now carried the scent of clean wood and something warmer, something lived in. It was not new. It was not meant to be. It was something else. Something that had endured. Cade stood at the edge of the dock just after sunrise, hands resting loosely at his sides, eyes fixed on the lake. The water reflected the sky in pale streaks of gold and blue, rippling gently as the morning wind moved across its surface. Flint lay beside him. The German shepherd had aged in ways that only someone who watched closely would notice. The fur along his muzzle had begun to lighten, threads of gray working their way through the black and tan. The old injury along his shoulder no longer slowed him, but it remained, a faint stiffness in colder mornings, a subtle shift in weight when he stood too quickly. He did not complain. He never had. His eyes remained the same, focused, present, watching the world not as it appeared, but as it was. Cade exhaled slowly. There were still nights when sleep refused to come. Still moments when sound broke the surface of the present and dragged something older with it. Still days when silence pressed in too tightly. None of that had changed. But something else had. Those things no longer decided what he did next. The dock had begun to fill again, not crowded, never that, but alive. The repairs Cade had made did not go unnoticed. At first it had been small, someone asking if he could take a look at a motor, another needing help patching a loose plank, a third simply stopping to ask if he had spare tools. Cade had not said yes right away, but he had stopped saying no. That was enough. The money from Gideon Hale's chest had not lasted forever. Cade had used part of it carefully, deliberately, replacing structural beams along the dock, reinforcing weak joints, repairing sections that would have failed under the weight of another storm. He did not do it for recognition. He did it because he knew what it meant when something held. Because he knew what it meant when it didn't. Mara Bellamy noticed the changes first, though she never pointed them out directly. She stood on the dock one afternoon, hands resting on her hips, watching Cade finish securing a new support beam beneath one of the outer platforms. "You're making it harder for him to tear this place down," she said. Cade didn't look up. "Good." Mara tilted her head slightly. That wasn't a complaint. Cade tightened the last bolt, then stood, wiping his hands against a cloth. "He'll still try," he said. "Victor always tries," Mara replied. "That's what men like him do when they think something belongs to them." Cade glanced toward the tree line where the road disappeared into shadow. "Let him." Mara studied him for a moment longer than usual. There was something different in the way he stood now. Not stronger. Not louder. Just settled. "Careful," she said quietly. "Places like this have a way of making people think they can stay." Cade met her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Mara didn't respond. She didn't need to. It was later that evening, when the light had thinned and the lake had begun to mirror the sky more clearly, that Flint moved again. Not toward the water, not toward the dock, toward the cabin wall. The same wall where Cade had pinned Noah's drawing. The German shepherd stood there, still, head tilted slightly, not confused, not uncertain, just focused. Cade watched him from the doorway. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Flint didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the drawing, on the star. Cade stepped closer. The paper had aged slightly at the edges from exposure to light, but the lines remained clear. The man, the dog, the houseboat, and above them, the star. For a brief moment, the fading sunlight shifted just enough that the reflection from the lake reached through the window and touched the wall. The light aligned with the drawing. The star seemed to glow. Not bright, not unnatural, just present. Flint lowered himself slowly to the floor beneath it, resting his head against his paws. Cade stood there longer than he intended, watching, not trying to understand, just letting it be. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to question what it meant. That was new. Days passed, then more. The rhythm of the place settled into something steady. Earl Whitaker returned more often now, his repaired boat running smoothly, his quiet presence becoming part of the dock's daily pattern. He never stayed long, never spoke more than necessary, but each time he left, he gave a small nod toward Cade. Approval, respect, unspoken. Others followed. A younger fisherman named Caleb Turner, a man in his early 30s with sunburned skin and restless energy, began stopping by to ask questions he already knew the answers to, just to have a reason to stay longer. Caleb was tall, lanky, with sandy hair that never seemed to stay in place, and a habit of talking faster than his thoughts could organize themselves. He had grown up near the lake, but had left for a few years, returning with the quiet realization that not everything better existed somewhere else. He respected Cade immediately, not because Cade demanded it, because Cade didn't. "You fixed that carb yourself?" Caleb asked one afternoon, leaning against the railing. "Yeah." Caleb nodded, impressed despite trying not to show it. "Figured." He didn't ask anything else. That was enough. The houseboat changed slowly, not dramatically, Not all at once, but piece by piece, it became something that could hold weight, physical and otherwise. Cade added small things: a lantern near the door, a reinforced table inside the cabin, a set of hooks along the wall for tools that no longer needed to be searched for. And on the wall, always in the same place, the drawing remained. He never moved it, never covered it, never explained it. It was simply there, like something that had always been waiting. The package had changed something in him. He didn't talk about it, didn't need to. But the doubt that had followed him from the moment he left Idaho had quieted. Not disappeared, just stepped back. He no longer questioned why the drawing matched the place, or how. Some questions didn't need answers. They needed time. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Cade stood at the edge of the dock again. Flint lay beside him, breathing slow, steady. The lake was still, the air cool, the world quiet in a way that didn't feel empty. Cade looked out across the water. For a long time he had believed that survival meant movement. Keep going, don't stop. Don't stay long enough for anything to break. But standing there, with the dock beneath him, the houseboat behind him, and Flint beside him, he realized something that didn't come as a thought. It came as a feeling. He wasn't here because he had been saved. No one had pulled him out. No moment had changed everything. He was here because he had stopped leaving. That was the difference. Flint shifted slightly, pressing closer against his leg. Cade rested a hand on the dog's head, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Flint didn't answer. Didn't need to. The lake caught the first light of the rising sun, reflecting it back in long, quiet lines. Cade watched it. Not searching, not scanning, just watching. The thought came then, simple, clear, not forced. He didn't want to leave, not because he couldn't, because he didn't need to. The difference mattered. Cade stood there for a while longer, the world waking slowly around him. Then he turned, walked back toward the houseboat, not as a place he had found, but as a place he had chosen. And this time, he didn't feel like he was passing through. Sometimes the miracle is not loud. It doesn't arrive with a sudden rescue, a perfect ending, or a moment that changes everything at once. Sometimes, it comes quietly, through a loyal companion who refuses to leave your side, through a stranger who shows up at the right time, or through a place that feels like it was waiting for you long before you even knew you were lost. Maybe that's how God works. Not by removing every struggle, but by placing just enough light along your path so you don't lose your way completely. Not by giving you a new life overnight, but by giving you the strength to stay, to rebuild, and to choose again when it would be easier to walk away. In our daily lives, we often look for big signs, big answers, big changes. But the truth is, the quiet moments matter just as much. The small decisions to keep going, to help someone, to not give up on yourself. That's where grace lives. That's where healing begins. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Let them know they are not alone. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what part of this story touched your heart the most. And if you believe that God still works in quiet, unseen ways, write amen below. Don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories for more journeys of courage, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you to the place your heart has been searching for.